The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon. This is Robert Marty. I'm the product marketing manager for all of the identity products here at Broadcom. I wanted to welcome you all to this first in a series of hopefully 3 webinars we're going to do on Symantec IGA. I'd also like to thank our 2 partners, ANI Solutions and Secure Identity Solutions, for helping to put this content together. I know that nobody wants to listen to a marketing guy for an hour, so I will turn it over to Chris Taylor, a gentleman I've known for over 20 years. We met back when I was at Integrity, actually, and he's had over 20 years of experience implementing specifically our products and others. But Chris, I'll turn it over to you, and I will go on mute, and I will just interrupt you if I see any questions come through.
All right. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Just wanted to give you guys a brief overview. So ANI Solutions actually has been a partner with Secure Identity Solutions for probably about 12 years now. They are a strategic partner of Broadcom's, but also of Secure Identity Solutions. So we definitely appreciate their involvement and support with this presentation as well. They provide a broad amount of services and support for Broadcom customers and product suites for all the different verticals, as you could see. Secure Identity Solutions, we're pretty much a boutique security consulting firm focusing on identity, as Rob said, and as you guys can read, I'm not going to bore you with what we do here, but we've been around since 2006. All right, so let's get started. So we kind of did introductions. We're going to talk about what is IGA, why are best practices important, what are some key management best practices, and technical best practices. All right. So the Symantec Identity Governance Administration Suite or platform is primarily composed of 3 products: Identity Manager, Identity Governance, Identity Portal. We like to also consider directory and reporting as a supporting pieces of this platform. But these are the 3 main pieces that are visible to most people when they're, whether it's the business or technical teams, and as far as integration points. This is what you're going to see. You're going to see Identity Manager, you're going to see the portal, and you're going to see the attestations coming out of governance. Right? So what does this suite provide? I mean, hopefully most of you are aware of the value that it brings to the table. Obviously, user provisioning, self-service, identity governance allows organizations to address the challenges of data privacy, privileged access governance, and security compliance in managing least privileged access. Right? So the feature sets that are brought to the table allow users to address this in their entirety. So today we're gonna, we always like to start with what are rules of thumb, right? A rule of thumb is a method or principle that is based on experience, common sense, practicality, rather than on precise or scientific measures. They're not intended to be exact, but what we gain from rules of thumb is level of experience. So as we go through projects, as we go through implementations, these rules of thumb are integrated into best practices for the industry, best practices for products, and so on. What they allow us to do is to figure out what's worked, what hasn't worked, and to refine that process over time, right? We have the ability as humans to adapt and to evolve, to learn from our failures and gain a vast amount of knowledge so that we can hopefully repeat our successes. Why are best practices important for technology? They provide a set of guidelines that help organizations achieve their optimal results, avoid common pitfalls. They can also help organizations stay up to date with the latest trends and technologies. Best practices can be used for benchmarking and self-assessment. We often think about best practices as really being a part of IT frameworks, right? IT service management frameworks, but they are not necessarily always part of frameworks. They can live outside of those as well. Right. So what are we going to talk about today? Now, Gartner has two primary categories for best practices. One is cost and risk, and the other one is service level. We like to categorize ours a little bit differently. We're not talking about all best practices today. We're really talking about the collection of best practices that we've come across that we believe that will help organizations be successful in IGA implementations. So we like to categorize them as the ones that fall under management and the ones that fall under technical. As was mentioned earlier, this is the first of three, series, and this one is more about the high-level management of an implementation with the technical best practices, whereas the other two are going to be focused more on product-specific and domain-specific expertise around those products. So, at a high level, management best practices are a set of processes and systems that will help the organization manage the implementation. We like to think of these as the guardrails. There are 5 subcategories here. There's project, resources, infrastructure, compliance, and risk. In contrast, technical best practices are those things that are specifically geared towards achieving the technical goals of the project. They most likely incorporate domain-specific principles. So let's set the stage for what I'm about to talk about for the next few slides. Regardless of the type of project management your organization uses, project management relies on carefully crafted and well-conceived project plans and supporting documentation. Project plans are essential to successfully managing the organization's expectations around the project. If you already have an IGA solution, a project plan will help the organization craft the communication strategy that will minimize the disruption to the business. It is important to find a strong project manager to lead this endeavor. Project manager will need to depend on strong technical lead, or most likely a technical architect, to ensure the project management and technical goals are aligned. We often see poor project management processes cause the greatest amount of problems when we talk about IGA solutions. Well, one of the driving reasons is that these types of projects are usually not directly driven by a business requirement per se. The business may have a requirement for faster onboarding or seamless access across platforms, but those are high-level goals. It is often left up to the technical staff, the people on the ground, to implement or upgrade an IGA solution, and they may not be supported by project management staff, right? Because they're expected at with their experience and technical acumen to be able to deliver these projects. But they still need project oversight, still need project management. As we're all aware, if the project slows down or goes over budget, this will become a major topic of discussion, and the business will ask questions that most of us would not want to answer. Properly resourcing the project management team for an IGA project is crucial, and is something that will hopefully ensure the project runs smoothly. Now we've set the stage, let's talk about topic at hand. So we like to talk about this in very clear terms. So we go collect, document, and analyze. Right? IGA solutions are connected to everything. And because they are, the implementation and integration require a high degree of coordination across the enterprise. it's important to know who owns what, how do you change it, when or if it can be changed, and what are the limitations. It is important that the project plan captures the interconnected nature of the solution. A RACI matrix is part of the plan stage of plan, do, act cycle. RACI is an acronym for responsibility, accountability, consulted, and informed. So to understand who owns what can be done, are we communicating with all of the people who are responsible, and who's accountable if something goes wrong is critical, not only in IGA projects, but IT projects in general, but especially when we're talking about systems that are so involved in the business operations as IGA. Collecting and documenting who owns what is essential, but the failure to document critical and key pieces of information is a costly obstacle to overcome. It is important to know what you're implementing and why. If this is an IGA upgrade, you don't know, excuse me, do you know what the current solution does? Are there any new requirements? These are essential questions. If this is a new implementation, do you know what the requirements are for the project to be considered a success? You must not only know what you're replacing, but you also need to know, are there things about my current system that are done in a manner that was less than optimal? The upgrade or new implementation may be an opportunity to improve a process, improve integration. We all have less than optimal skeletons in our closets. There are very few technical implementations that have everything implemented as we want it. So clearly understanding what your current solution does, how it does it, and why it does it the way it does is critical. I actually went too far there, sorry. If this is a greenfield implementation, it's important to clearly define the architecture, clearly define integration points, define the owners, as we mentioned. In addition to architecture and design activities, it's important to understand what the system should look like when you're done. So when we talk about current system, now we're talking about future state. And how are we going to get there? So if it's a new implementation, how are we going to get from where we are to where we need to be? If it's a upgrade, how are we going to do that, right? What are the steps in between? Who are the people that need to be involved to help us get there? Right? So documentation doesn't stop at the architecture process or planning phase of the implementation. It's important clearly define the test cases. So whatever you devise as your requirements, whatever you devise as your goals need to turn into test cases, need to turn into standard operating procedures. All of these things are critical because if you're delivered a brand new shiny system, but you don't know how to run it, then that's not gonna do anyone any good. You need to understand how and what is available to you and to the organization to ensure that that system has longevity. We're often brought into organizations to do health checks for IGA solutions. And what we see is a range of documentation. Some customers have very good documentation, but it's not up to date. Server names are wrong, locations are wrong, owners are wrong. Some customers have no documentation for their solution. They lack even the most basic items. But what we see most common is customers that have a few Visios that show communications, but not much else. All of these present different challenges. But it's important to remember, if you invest in documenting the solution in its entirety, all the way through from inception through implementation, and the care and feeding afterwards, you will save time, money, and frustration later. Understand the dependencies outside of the solution. Capture them early, or they will haunt you later. So even in the cases where customers have documentation, we rarely see instances where customers have documented why something was done. It's important to capture exceptions to the rule. So documenting the exceptions to best practices, the exceptions to standards, is critical in maintaining a solution long term. But also, when it's time to change the solution later, you know why. You know why it was put in place. You would know why something was done a certain way, right? For example, there may be a business requirement or budget constraint that forced a technical decision. Make note of it. I guarantee that 3 years from now, no one will remember why X was done in a certain way, and will cause a big debate about whether it can be changed or not. If it's not documented as an exception, if it is documented as an exception, you can always find out if that condition which caused the exception is still valid. Documentation should be living. So it's not printed out and stuck on the shelf, but it's something that's constantly maintained as things occur. Right? Anytime a patch or modification to a flow is executed, update the documentation to reflect it. So when we talk about versions, we're not necessarily talking about product versions, but we're talking about versions of the solution, because the solution constantly evolves. And so how do we track versions? How do we track states of the solution? So you keep backups of everything. You back up the configurations. You back up any components any static files or things that would allow that represent the system as it stands. And as those things change, you back those things up. So we're not just talking about your normal your disaster prevention, where you're backing up, but we're talking about the configuration. Allow yourself flexibility to recover in case a mistake is made, a system is changed inadvertently, or someone inadvertently deletes or removes something that is important. So in the same vein, code repositories. We generally, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, recommend kind of avoiding custom code, but it's nearly impossible. So if you are going to develop custom code, store it. It's important to understand if you have a DLL, but you don't have the source, if you have a Java class file, you don't have the source, yes, you can decompile it, but it won't be exact. But also you may lack the documentation for that, right? Why certain coding decisions were made. But if you're keeping your code safe in a code repository, then you will always be able to go back, recreate DLLs, update classes, make the changes that need to be made to keep your system up to date. Right? Now, when we talk about documentation, we were generally talking about, we talked about what you should document, but documentation is no use to anyone if it can't be found. We recently had a customer who lost a resource to another company, and this person had been with the company for over 25 years. He walked out of the door with a vast amount of institutional knowledge, and no one took it upon themselves to archive any of his documents from his network share. In 90 days, the documents were deleted. Designate a place for document storage. If it's SharePoint or some other document management, infrastructure, it will allow you to avoid a brain drain when it comes to personnel leaving, personnel shifting jobs. And sometimes some of us get older and we just forget things, right? So the next area is resource management. And we often like to talk about what do internal resources need to be successful and what do external resources need to be successful. Make sure you bring the right resources to the project. Okay. It is not as simple as having the right person on staff or contracting with the right consulting group. This may shock you, but I believe in advocating for bringing in consultants. It is also important to understand the resources you have managing the system need continuing education. They need the requisite experience to manage the system that they're operating. So in the case of many individuals, there's not just the person who's managing your IGA solution, they do more than just manage that solution. They probably wear another 10 to 12 hats, right? So they're not going to be up to date on all the features and functionalities of the latest IGA release, right? So if you implemented your IGA solution 5 years ago and you're upgrading now to the latest and greatest shiny new toy, they're not going to necessarily know all of the best practices around that, right? So they're going to need continuing education. Ideally, instructor-led education is best. And if you have enough staff, it makes sense to even leverage custom training to support them. But you have to make sure that they are equipped to deal with this integrated, interconnected solution and have the right things at their disposal to be successful. Okay. So if you go out and get consultants, what do they need, right? They're gonna require, excuse me, for lack of a better term, they're gonna need requirements. They're gonna need to understand what you're asking them to build. And they're gonna need to do that in you're gonna need to provide clear requirements that are clearly articulated, that are tied to the end design. They should be delivering a solution that's based on requirements that either is designed by them based on those requirements or in coordination with you, so that you can get the right solution developed. And this is where having experienced architects or having experienced technical staff is very important. Because if you can if you can provide the right technical oversight at an organizational level, you can make sure that the solution works and it fits in. Right. So once you design a solution, someone has to deliver it, right? Whether it's the outside group delivering it for you. So on the delivery side, delivery is always a difficult step in the process. But it can be made, you can reduce the friction within the organization by having those prerequisites met. Having documentation, having requirements, having a good design, having a test plan. Because if you lack those things, delivery is much harder. Okay. And you need to understand how the decisions you make throughout the process will impact your delivery. Do you have an SQA team? Do you have support team to do testing? Right? These are critical components. Right. So a general best practice for any IT project is to break it up into manageable pieces. Figure out ways to make the implementation smaller. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't get the features you want, but you don't have to roll out all the features that you want at the same time. When dealing with an outside vendor who is not familiar with how the organization works, you may want to make sure that you have as many safeguards in place as possible. One of my mentors used to always tell me, under promise and over deliver. If you're upgrading a solution that has been in place for many years, find a way to migrate functionality away over a series of releases. For your delivery of, once the solution is delivered, early operations. When we talk about early operations, we're really talking about the stage in the project where the solution has just hit the door. The first release has just gone out. And in that case, we need to shake it out. We need to figure out what the problems are. But what you also need to do is plan for that any of the consultants or outside staff you brought in to support the solution for the development, they're present. Because you don't want to walk away, you don't want them walking away as soon as it's implemented, because there will be things that come up. Now, documenting things early in the process and making sure they're thorough will help manage that process, right? Make that a little bit easier for you. But it's important to validate any of the standard operating procedures early on in the release of the product, the solution, so that it is validated and that you are able to maintain it without with the least amount of heartache going forward. Right. All right. So what's important when we talk about infrastructure? We're always going to be updating a solution, any IT solution for that matter, because there's always going to be fixes. There are always going to be bugs. There are always going to be things that have to be addressed, right? And there will also be new updates, like new features the organization wants to roll out, but new features that the vendor, such as Broadcom, will release that you want to take advantage of, right? So, but you also are impacted by the things that are not necessarily part of the IGA solution, but that solution depends on. For example, operating systems, networks, firewalls, load balancers, right? So once again, understanding how those change processes work, how do they impact the IGA solution will ensure that you have a smooth transition to production, right? So one of the things that comes up quite a bit now is DR site diversity, because one of the things that we see, especially with organizations that leverage maybe Azure, AWS, that they're really not thinking about diversity from a cloud perspective of DR. So having multiple zones within a region or multiple regions when they deploy. So they're really looking at the cloud as their DR, but not necessarily planning for if the cloud is not available in that region or zone. So understanding what your diversity, your DR diversity looks like, and how you can achieve that the greatest amount of stability in case there's something goes wrong is a critical item. So obviously DR is considered an environment, but we also, you have prod, you have non-prod, you have dev, you have these other environments that you must figure out how you're going to leverage. Make sure that you have enough environments. So it's not good enough to have prod. You need dev, you need a test, you need as many sub-environments to prod that you can afford. And the reason that you want to achieve this is that you are looking for the best stability. You want to make sure that not only your solution works, but the processes around the solution works. And as you migrate between environments, the dev, test, prod, you work those things out. Those processes are documented, they're executed, and sometimes you've automated deployment of these things, right? So when you get into environments, it's important to understand why you need them, but also they have value. If you ever need to go back, if you ever need to replicate an issue in prod in a lower environment, you can. If you need to troubleshoot why something is happening in prod, but you know that doing so would bring down prod, you can replicate that in a lower environment, right? And to that effect, you have to plan for your system living long beyond what you think it's going to be present for. So for example, the life expectation of a system, if you think it's going to be 3 years, you need to plan on 9 years because things change, life happens, right? So this goes back to making sure that your requirements are clearly articulated, making sure that your design, the design that you were trying to achieve is aligned with this as well, right? Because if you are planning on a system only being there 3 years, but it's there 9 years, because you thought you'd have an opportunity to upgrade or replace something that wasn't done optimally, it never works out that way, right? You never have an opportunity to go back and fix. So there's always a day. Do we always get to day 2 fixes? No. Because day 2 fixes turn into day 800 fixes, right? Because we never get back to them, right? The rest of these items, such as, so data center diversity is going along with what we talked about as far as DR diversity. The same strategy applies. If you are located across, have multiple data centers, represent your solution, have your solution placed across multiple data centers, geographically dispersed, so you have business continuity in the event of one data center becoming unavailable. Make sure that you're backing up the solution. So I talked about backing up configurations, but you need to back up all the big things. You need to back up the databases, the LDAPs, the servers, so that you are always in a place where if you just lose a machine, you can recover. But if you lose a set of machines, you can recover as well, right? And whatever thing you do around backups, make sure that you understand your backup strategy, your data retention plan, right? And make sure that you don't lose critical information because someone didn't understand how long things are kept, right? Especially if you're talking about user store data or data that is specific to customers' identities, right? All right. So let's talk about compliance. Although we're deploying an IGA solution, compliance plays a significant role into planning and building of the solution. It's important to understand that data associated with the platform, we're primarily concerned with the data that's associated with the users and transactions for, say, provisioning access for users. Logging can be a great tool, but logging more information than necessary can create compliance issues. When determining what needs to be logged to meet operational requirements, don't forget to focus on what type of data that could potentially be logged, such as PI, PII, HIPAA, or even PCI. So one of the things that we regularly see is that there's too much information being logged in the fear that it may be needed for troubleshooting. And there's a careful balance here. We have to figure out, okay, what makes sense, right? How much should we look at? How much should we keep? But also knowing that if we log too much, it puts us in a precarious position in case there is data leakage, right? So we want to make sure that that is constantly evaluated. Okay, are we logging Social Security number? Should we be logging Social Security number? Right? Are we logging information that could be personally identifiable for someone? We need to make sure that we are considering these things so that, because logs just don't sit on a server, they get moved around. They go to log aggregation, they go to systems like Logarithm, and that information now may be exposed to other people that may not should have access to it. Okay. If you need reporting for these systems, you need to consider all the things that you want to report on. Right? It's great that the product has reporting built into it, but they're going to be, if you have reporting questions that management wants, or auditing, or security, you got to make sure that any of that thought process, any of those decisions that need to go into what we should be reporting on are made early, right? Because you don't want to build a solution that lacks certain information when you need it in a report. So that goes back to early on, understanding who's responsible for what, understanding also what the requirements are to ensure that you implement a solution that is geared to meeting the needs of the organization. So if reporting is required for a certain process, say provisioning, and that data is not being captured by the standard process, you need to enrich that data. So you need to figure out how that happens, right? To make sure that you get what you want out of the solution. We often run into organizations where they don't know what they want. They just want to report, but they don't know what they want to report on, which becomes problematic because a lot of times you can't go back and enrich data if you've made certain decisions, right? So risk management is obviously something that everyone is concerned with, right? So we all know the pitfalls, right? It is important that an organization has a strong and clear security policy and helps mitigate risk associated with solutions that are implemented. Risk can take many forms, right? Risk can be associated with a process or a lack of a process. For example, your IGA standard operating procedures should dictate how changes are made, but it should also dictate that before a change is made, the configuration is backed up or exported in some fashion. So we are the risk that we're talking about is really managing the risk of any changes or operational modifications to how things work, right? Are you backing up the change after you make it, right? So that you have a pre-change configuration and a post-change configuration. This provides a couple, doing certain steps like this provide benefit to the organization. One, you can figure out, hey, I know what changed and I can always roll back to that, but also know what the end result was, right? And you can archive those things that allow them to be used in the future. Right? So avoid, wherever possible, incorrect service account use when you're deploying IGA solutions, right? We've seen in the past where the service accounts are used and they're used in the same service account is used for everything within a product. Now, you can do that, but not necessarily a best practice, right? So the process that is running, your website, your web application server versus the identity that's used within Identity Manager as the system manager, they should all be unique, and they should be, those passwords those service accounts should be protected, right? You want to make sure that you have the clearest audit trail possible when it comes to service accounts that support your infrastructure. Okay, because if you lack clarity around how service accounts are being used, especially in an automated fashion, that you don't necessarily know what these accounts should be doing, it should be clear that this account is used for this purpose and you only see it using it for this purpose, right? But it could raise flags if you see one account that should be doing X, but it's doing 5 other things as well, right? So managing service account usage correctly is very important, because it may not directly impact the system per se, but it will impact any audit events that that may arise from the misuse, right? So another topic we often see is the passwords in plain text. Passwords are sitting on file systems. Passwords are kind of sitting around, and no one ever thinks about a password sitting in the clear after the implementation, right? They know it was done, but we need to avoid it. You need to avoid, leaving a password in a file. That's plain text. Take the extra step, plan around it, do something else to ensure that you are prepared, and you don't have to run into that type of scenario. All right. Okay, we already talked about. So we talked about backup and configurations, but let's talk about monitoring and alerts. So one of the IGA solutions are critical business tools. And as such, they should be monitored, right? Putting a monitoring platform in place to watch the health of the system. You should be alerting on performance. You should be alerting on errors. You should be alerting on any anomalies with the system. So whether it's performance, whether it's response time, throughput, you should have a good understanding of what the system is, how the system is performing at all times, right? Because having that visibility will avoid issues down the road, but also allow you to plan for scaling, plan for growth. If you don't have any understanding of what your system is performing or what metrics that is associated with the platform, you won't have a clear understanding of how you need to grow it. How many more servers, how many more databases, or how should you scale the databases associated, right? Because we're always looking at, okay, I'm only going to respond when something happens. Is this an anomaly, or was this a trend, right? All right, let's talk about, these are pretty self-explanatory, but avoid single points of failure. Plan for disaster recovery. And we're going to say use an architect to work. You need an enterprise architect. You need someone who has the ability at a top level to look at your IGA implementation and figure out where it fits into the organization. You need someone who understands the technology of the organization and figure out it makes sense that it connects here. It makes sense that it connects in this manner. It cannot be overstated that the lack of technical architects are very dangerous to an IGA solution. So, server optimization. We often see that organizations need to have people filling roles of optimizing servers. And that's the operating system, that's the services. And we're not talking about the IGA pieces itself, but really talking about the underlying hardware, virtual machines or operating system, because that's where you're going to get the bang for your buck. And it's not going to be a lot that a vendor can do other than make some general recommendations, but you really need to leverage the resources that you have to get the best operating system, best performance out of the solution possible, right? And the last one is pretty clear. Secure all connections wherever possible. We walk into many organizations where standard LDAP or unsecured database ports are leveraged, but we always recommend securing your connections wherever possible, so every endpoint that is available. All right. So we talked about in the management section, but now we're going to talk about infrastructure here. All right. We often see solutions are impacted by individuals that are not involved in not communicating to the core teams about what is needed. So when changes happen in the organization, they impact IGA. It's plain and simple. A firewall change, a load balancer change, a database change, right, will impact IGA, plain and simple, because it is a connected system. Now, log files, right, become a management of them own, of their a management burden themselves, right? So we talked about what to log or being careful what you log, but now how do I manage logs? Where will the logs go? How often should I rotate logs, right? Then that goes back to your data retention, but also you don't want to cause an outage because you've run out of disk space, right? Same thing with databases. So we've seen scenarios where we recommend, a database size, a database configuration, but we're making general recommendations, whereas the DBA is not involved may not be involved in the maintenance of the database. They think that this thing is self-maintaining when it's not. So it goes back to ownership. Who owns it? So back to that RACI matrix, right? Who is going to own the database? It's not the IGA team. The IGA is just a consumer of it, right? In this case. Now, the last topic is a little bit sticky here, is server hardening. Server hardening is something that needs to be considered in all implementations for any solution, but IGA as well, because of the sensitive nature of what it does, right? It provisions. So if we generally take the approach that if you are going to do server hardening, it's best to do it after the initial install in a lower environment to see what is impacted. Luckily, you can work with your outside consultants who should be talking to a Broadcom to understand what the impacts of that will be, right? Because you don't want to get into a situation where you don't understand the pitfalls of taking certain steps. But luckily, the consultants you're going to deal with or Broadcom indirectly will have that information available that kind of makes that a little bit easier for you. So this gets to one of my favorite topics is regression testing, right? Every time you change, you regress. You do a regression test. Make a change, you regression test. This is important. You need to know where you stand, because we often see that organizations don't know what worked in the past in certain cases, in certain scenarios, because they may have lacked the test plan, right? Going back to documentation. They may have lacked a testing strategy because there were no use cases developed from the requirements, right? But if you're always regression testing after every change, you know where you stand, right? Another one is minimum custom code. Although we know that you can't get away from it, but minimize as much of it as you can. If there comes a choice between doing it in the product and doing it with custom code, you may want to invest the time to do it in the product, even if it takes a little bit longer. And that's because it becomes something that is maintained by the vendor, meaning that, hey, that functionality works out of the box. And even in cases where there is no support for it, you can always talk to Broadcom and ask about future releases. You can always put in requests to say, hey, we're thinking about X. You guys don't support it. Will you support it in the future? And that may be something that we consider. But minimize as much custom code as possible. It'll make the operation and longevity of the system much easier. All right. Test data. So always have the ability to test the solution, whether you're in prod or a lower environment. And what I mean by that is there are certain situations if you lack the ability to test in a production environment and you're dependent on really your users being your testers. Believe it or not, we see this quite common that there's no test data for prod. And as a result, a solution can't be tested. properly prior to go live. So you want to avoid those types of things at all costs. Negative testing, right? Negative testing is something that you need to know what the outcome would be if you do something wrong. We see a lot of people when they're testing, they test the positive case, but they're not testing the negative case. And negative case may expose vulnerabilities, may expose a brand issue that you don't want to factor in. So you want to make sure that whatever testing you do, you're testing the positive path and negative path, right? Especially if you're looking at that goes along with the regression testing as well, to ensure that you have a clear understanding of what the system does in both the good and bad circumstances, right? I think we beat logging to death, so I'll skip that one. But the other one is naming conventions. So within our organization, when we do implementations, I harp on naming conventions because how you name different items and configurations will allow easier maintenance of those solutions. So in the case of Identity Manager, naming your policies, naming your policy express, your policy express policies, your tasks in certain ways, allow you to kind of follow a flow through the VST to understand what's occurring. We've come into organizations where a lot of times that stuff is very generic and you can't tell what's happening at a high level from looking at logs or looking at the VST. So choosing names, choosing things that make sense to the maintainers of the system will help you better maintain the solution in the long term and allow a quick, faster resolution to problems as well. So to recap, best practices, the benefits are basically, we're going to put the guardrails. So the guardrails are the management best practices. The technical best practices are the things that allow you to achieve success with that implementation, right? IGA solutions are completely connected to everything in the organization, and as such require a level of expertise and a level of planning coordination that allow these systems to bring the value that they have. And you have to figure out ways to make sure that no matter if it's an upgrade or it's a new implementation, you're delivering a solution that achieves the goals that you set out to, right? And sometimes you are going to piecemeal a deployment because it's the safer route, right? It goes back to managing that risk. But the goal is to deliver a solution that provides you the self-service, automated provisioning, zero trust capability that your organization may be looking for. So on that note, I'm going to pass it to Rob. I don't know if there's any questions.
So I don't see any questions in here, but I would certainly, oh, I see somebody, let's see here. Oh, I have a hand raised. Let me just unmute you. If you guys have a question, I'll just go ahead and unmute guys. Let's see. Let's try that. Somebody have a question they want to ask? Can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Oh, someone asked if there's a roadmap for implementation. I don't know if I understand that question.
So we're going to talk about implementation, the technical pieces in the later I can't remember what the next one is titled, but I think the next one is the roadmap of how we get to implementing a solution, right? These are kind of the things that we put around to make sure that we get there, but I think that's going to be part of the next one.
Okay, and we have a question here about explaining why it is to use less customized code. I think I'll let you handle that one.
So the less customized code gives us the ability to gives you the ability to kind of have the system maintained, and it could be self-maintained, right? You can also bring in outside resources that understand the system, but that may not be coding experts, because what we see in organizations is sometimes there's a failure to understand how that code impacts the performance of a system, right? Or impacts how a system works. Now, we also know that with Broadcom releasing, 2 upgrades a year to these systems, you may end up in a position where that custom code may not work in the near future. But generally, there are ways to provide access, ways to achieve certain goals with this certain, I guess, meet certain ends, with the solution that you may not need the custom code, because managing custom code requires expertise, code development, repository, and so on. So we typically can't avoid it in all cases, but a lot of times if you have good architect, good solution engineers, they can figure out ways to leverage the solution to perform the business requirements as you need it without necessarily requiring custom code. But it's not always the case.
Okay, how do we handle the challenges related to third-party tools licensing like PDI and Jasper reports?
So so I guess they're asking about the Jasper reports. I think, Rob, that's included as part of the deployment. The license comes with the reporting for IGA for Jasper reports. What was the other one was PDI, which is I forget the name of that, but I think that license is included as well. That is the coding. Excuse me, I'm losing track, but I think that's the portion you guys include with IGA. IG, to handle data transformation.
Okay.
That is also included with the product. Yep.
Okay, I see somebody has 3 questions. I tried to unmute you. There's a question I can answer. One of the next webinars, I will say that there. Oh, did you get unmuted?
Yeah. Thanks for unmuting me. So my name is Agni, and I'm working with Symantec IGA 14.4 CP2 version in my client's location. I have 3 questions actually. The first question is what is the roadmap for the cloud side of things? Like right now, what I understand, it's all about on-prem and or else virtual appliance, but software as a service like SaaS implementations is there a roadmap for it?
So I can actually answer this question. We will be having a IGA office hours in 2 weeks. When we send out the thank you email for this event, there will be a link to register for that, and the product management team is going to go through the roadmap for IGA. They're also going to discuss if you have any experience with SiteMinder, you've probably heard of the VIP Authentication Hub, which was our first modernization effort for our new platform called SSP, Security Services Platform. These are all containerized. So it's not quite SaaS, but it's designed to run in the cloud, and there's going to be another version of that that's coming out called Identity Services, which will start to put some of the identity management services up into the cloud, running in a Kubernetes container. They'll have some more information about that on this upcoming office hours. So that has been our kind of strategy right now, is to not go go directly to the cloud, but to start to put components that are cloud native, and start to modernize in that way to help our customers kind of bridge that gap rather than going to trying to do full cloud, which if you've been around that long, you know that we've struggled in trying to go full cloud in the past. So I'll let you answer the other two questions. I know Suzanne asked the same question. The next webinar that we're going to run with Chris and A&I would probably be sometime in the end of August, maybe early September. It depends on what we think, whether people will be around in August or whether we should wait till September. But like I said, there will be an office hours in 2 weeks, end of July, and then August we'll see. I'll have to check on Chris's schedule, but like I said, I think I might try and do it early September, just because people are done with the kids are back in school, kids are back, everybody's off from vacations, and it's a better time to come. And so go ahead. Ask the other two questions that you had. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay, so thanks for answering my first question. A second question I'm having is regarding REST API support with the application end. So I'm aware that from 14.1 or 14.2, I'm not very well versed with that, but I had read that SOAP API implementations were supported. So when are we expecting REST API support, not between connectors, but between applications? Because we are having certain applications in our environment which allow us to communicate through REST API, not with SOAP. So our customer is having this this urge of integrating all into one solution. But because of this unsupported of REST API, we are kind of stopped from implementations. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, no, I heard you. Rob, I have to turn that one over to you as well. Now, are you talking specific? Are you specifically talking about the twos, or are you talking about the fact because SCIM is available on the identity platform already? So, are you talking about something else, another type of integration outside of SCIM? Because I think SCIM is the approach that the product has gone.
Yeah, SCIM is internal though, right? Or is it external too?
It's external too.
Okay, it's inbound. Okay, I do know that there is a new REST framework for the connectors. I am not technical enough to even try to attempt to explain it, but that is a good question. If you want to come in 2 weeks, because the product management team will be there, and you can certainly ask that question there. They're the right people to answer.
Yeah, I asked the question. Why I asked the question, I'll tell you. The reason is because, I understand that Broadcom has gone into a process, into a framework that the functionalities have been split among different partners. Like there is a different person who is giving the support structure and AMC, and there's another partner who is going to give implementation suggestions, and we have to work with them. I get it, but we are not getting that appropriate answers regarding the REST platform, because when I went to other competitors during evaluations of other competitive tools, I saw that they have a well documented or an interface where we can see, okay, this application is supported or this application is not supported. That in case if we get a database like that or some information with that kind of displaying the content to the viewer, then I think we can be confident and say to the customer that yes, we can integrate this, because we are just using the identity manager application in our end for now. But definitely if the scope of the thing, of scope of the product can be explored more, we can try the other parts also. Like SiteMinder is not used,
Right.
but we can. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take that question down, and I'll see if I can try and get you some more information on the REST framework, because, like I said, I know it's relatively new in one of the newer releases I honestly don't know enough of them to say what it does supports and what it doesn't support. There is one more question about best practices in preparing segregation of duties and access matrix for various applications. That's actually a good question.
Okay. Can you, so that was the full question?
Yeah, best practices for SOD and access matrix.
Yeah, that's a interesting one because it depends on the organizations, right? So separation of duties, if you're going to look at separation of duties, you really have to explore, I guess, it differs per the products, right? So are you talking about the deployment of the products? Are you talking about the use of the products? So that's a hard one to kind of address, but typically organizations have, whether it's SOX, right? You have, standards of what you should separate, how people should be organized, right? And usually that will feed into responsibilities within, if you're talking about administrative responsibilities or administrative separation of duties. Because identity manager, obviously through identity policies and various other things, natively support, the separation of duties. And if you combine that with identity governance, you can actually get enforcement and obviously correction based on how you define separation of duties. So I know that probably didn't exactly answer the question, but there are some general practices around identity policies and use of identity governance to kind of enforce separation of duties, because it can understand compliance of where separation of duties there may be conflicts, and put people in roles that they shouldn't really have and correct that or notify them based on that. So you can automate that process.
I have a question. My name is Ahmed Makhlouf. I'm from Crédit Agricole in Egypt. We are a banking business. My question is to build the rule management in identity. What exactly I will need to know before start this step?
So you want to know what do you have to understand before you start role management?
Yes. Planning my roles.
Yeah, planning your roles
in the environment. Yes, it's rules in and apply these rules in systems, in our system.
Right. So we used to do a top-down approach to role development back in the day. It feels like 100 years ago, but now, I mean, obviously there are tools. So identity governance can allow you to kind of figure out what the roles should be. But generally what we like to look at is, how they're being used in the applications, and where does it make sense to kind of create role aggregates, right? Roles within Identity Manager that kind of aggregate multiple application roles, right? That could be grouped based on title. So one organization we recently did a project for, they had everything based on roles, and they are now asking us to look at titles, because the titles mean stuff. They have very specific codes in their titles, and they want the titles to dictate access packages, right? So what that involves is understanding in each job function what application should they have access to, right? So I think what you need to figure out is looking at who uses what applications you have, what are kind of the breakdowns of what they can do in each of those applications, and how should they roll up to functionality. What you don't want is a customer we saw many years ago. I think they had 5,000 people, but they had like 7,000 roles. And you don't want that, but you want the ability where it makes sense from a organizational perspective when people request things, but you don't want it to be overly complicated where people don't know what to request, right? So I don't know if you plan on automating the role provisioning. Then if you plan on automating it, as long as you have the data to make the decisions about this user is in this role, this location, which dictates they should have access to these applications, is an approach. But it really depends on the organization and how you're going to leverage your application, or how you're going to use the roles within the application. And if you have compliance and governance requirements, right? Because some organizations, going back to the separation of duties, certain people can have certain roles, right? In two different types of systems. But yeah, so hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, the second question is related to the infrastructure you are presented today. It's related to the disaster recovery. We are build our system here, and we have SRM in our data centers as a disaster recovery solution. It will be able to use in the identity management solution or identity governance or not, because we are using a virtual license here on-prem in VMware, and we are using the technology for SRM and NSX for data center replication. It will be able to use in this situation, or we will working with the standard hot and warm architecture for Procom designs.
Right. So I guess what you're asking is, should you be able to, should your SRM approach, will that support the identity governance? And is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I don't know enough about SRM to know, but what our experience in the past has been, most processes or especially if you have VM replication, VM hot site such as vSphere, those things have worked in the past. As far all the customers I've had who've had that, they've worked and they haven't really had any issues with it. But I think it depends on the specific technology that's being leveraged. But I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work. Obviously, you still have to take care of the other things, right? The database, right? As long as the database, in many cases, if the database is being replicated, the virtual machines are being replicated, you would not have and you have global load balancing or regional load balancing, global load balancing and routing, right, based on availability, then that everything should work as planned, right? But you should be able to figure, obviously, if you do your DR testing, you should be able to figure that out, hopefully, pretty quickly, and to know what won't work. And I'm pretty sure there are probably solutions for the things that you discover, though.
We haven't a test environment in SRM, but we have a test in IoT for the app license. Mm-hmm. And here the concept, we are migrate the VM with the same name and same IP to the DR. Okay.
Right.
In this case, we are not test it before. It's a new design. And we will work in it when we are complete the production installation or deployment. Okay, this is the point. And our migration, it's from the data store level in the VMware, not through the WebSphere or vSphere.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So the idea that you're keeping server names and you're keeping IP addresses, I think is a good step. I think that increases your success, right? Because you don't have to worry about changing, changing configurations to make that migration happen. And so I can't answer you on without using like a vSphere. I can't really answer should that be a problem or not. But I think as long as you are maintaining that consistency as far as the communication goes, meaning how the machines are referenced in the IP addresses, I think that gives you a greater chance of success for that working.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we had a series of other questions in here. I think some of these, so there's a good deal of these that I think are definitely going to be more for product management. Let's see, there was a couple roadmap, best practice on moving from VM to set up the V app. And we had talked, Chris, about having that as a session because we talked about that with Lynn.
Yep.
So that's a whole webinar in itself. I think we could probably definitely try to maybe incorporate that, or we even talked about putting a best practice guide for that because there are certain environments that are not ideal to go to the V app, and there are other ones that are perfectly well suited to move to the V app. So I think it's a best practice to do it, and then there's a best practice to decide whether you should do it. So
Right.
let's take that one offline and let's see if we can incorporate it in a future one because there's definitely a lot of interest from other people. Let's see, will there be support for multi-tenancy and multi-object application? I'm not sure if that's talking about the new identity services stuff we were talking about, the SSP stuff, or within IGA itself. So is custom connectors based on IGA architecture considered custom code? When we talk about using Connector Express, do we consider that to be custom code still or not necessarily?
Not really. No, yeah. So because we're using the connector server infrastructure, we don't really consider that custom code. When we say custom code, we're really talking about code that is developed outside of the tool set, right? Because we have all the Express features, right, that come within the IGA suite, right? So Connector Express is one of those things where we don't consider that custom code, although it's a custom connector. And also because obviously with Connector Server, you can develop a custom connector that's leveraged for Identity Manager and IG at the same time, right? So that's the beauty of that implementation, but you're not developing specifically for IDM or specifically for IG, right? You're developing a custom connector that can be leveraged throughout the infrastructure.
Yeah, he put Connector Express, but using IGA API.
Yeah. So yeah, it uses, so Connector Express talks to, you have a connector server, IG talks to connector server, which that's where the Connector Express connector lives, right? So it's you're not developing necessarily for IGA, you're developing a custom connector you're implementing a custom connector via Connector Express, and it just happens to support IG.
Okay, so let's see here. Someone asked about rescue an IP address after migrating. I just Rebish, I don't know if that's how you pronounce. I'm sorry if I messed up your name, but that's a question I would definitely open a support ticket on, or go to the communities and post it. The support guys monitor that as well. But that's definitely one that they could probably help you with on that. So let's see here. I think I've got a lot of the questions. There was a lot of questions in here. And I apologize if we missed any. But I wanted to thank everyone. And like I said, please, if you guys have a lot of some of these questions are very technical that should be going into to support people or to product management. They will both be on the line for the IGA office hours. We're trying to hold SiteMinder ones every 2 months in a row, and then we usually bring in an IGA, or we did directory a couple times. So the IGA will be up in the queue this month in July, then it'll be SiteMinder again for 2 months. But those are opportunities to speak directly with product management. There's usually a solutions engineer on the phone to do demos if they're going to demo any new functionality, and usually the lead support contact for IGAs there. The sessions are set up so that there's usually 20 to 30 minutes of presentation, and then there's usually 15 to 20 minutes left over for Q&A. It's a great time to ask any roadmap questions, any other questions. If it's a support issue, they may just push you through the support channels because they don't want to troubleshoot while we have a lot of people on the line, but certainly that's a good opportunity to ask some of these questions that didn't get answered. Tentative release time for 14.5. That's a good question. I can't answer it. But like I said, I think they're going to talk about the roadmap, so they may give you guidelines on when that you'll see the next release coming out in 2 weeks. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Everyone that's still on the line, you guys have already registered. We'll keep all of your information, and we will send you invitations for the next webinar that we're going to do with Chris. There should be a thank you email coming out probably the end of this week, maybe early next week, that will have the link to register for the upcoming office hours. So we had a really good showing today. I'd like to keep this in sync. And like I said, if we can build up a consistent number of people, maybe we'll start making the IGA office hours a little bit more frequent for you, if that's what you guys want to see. Oh, and one last plug for anyone. I don't know where everyone's located, but for anyone that's up in the Northeast, I think Staples is up there. We will be bringing back the Mohegan Sun event, an event that we used to host every year in the fall up in that area of the country. It'll be on September 29th. You will have information coming out shortly with landing pages and registration links. So we will see you there for those of you that are up in that section of the country. So thank you very much. And I will close this thing down because we're running a little bit over late, and I don't know how long this platform will allow me to record. So thank everyone for coming, and we'll talk to you more. Hopefully we'll see many of you in 2 weeks. If not, we'll see you probably in another month or so with Chris and our next webinar for this series.